welcome to another episode of Christian Answers for Today, and happy that you can be along for the journey. We are covering different topics that come up in the news. We're covering different questions that come up in the Christian community. Today we are tackling a contemporary issue that is in the news quite frequently in the last few weeks. A couple weeks ago we were discussing the different movies that have come out depicting biblical scenes. And we're going to get back to that also. But today we're going to be talking about the law that was passed in Indiana that caused so much controversy. It's called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It was signed into law by the Governor Mike Pence, and it caused all kinds of controversy. And you scratch your head and you say, well, why would this law cause all kinds of controversy? What was the law anyway? Well, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is a law that was passed in Indiana to guarantee that Christians, Jews, all kinds of different religions would not be forced to participate in business activities that violate their religious conscience. For example, if you're a Christian catering service and a so-called gay couple comes to you and wants to hire you to cater their so-called gay wedding reception, you have a right, based on your religious convictions, based on your doctrines and your moral values that you hold to, you have a right to say, I'm sorry, that goes against my religious conscience. I cannot do that, but I can refer you to another catering service that probably will, or similar kinds of conversations. Well, the law was passed to allow people who are Christians or Orthodox Jews or any kind of religion to not have to be forced to participate in activities that go against their conscience. And it seems like a very simple, very logical, very reasonable law. Who would want to force someone to go against their religious convictions, especially in a highly debatable, highly argued topic as, for example, so-called gay marriage or so-called same-sex marriage? Why would you want to force someone to go against their convictions if they oppose that, which every true Christian will oppose? The Bible is very clear on the topic. Homosexuality is a sin. That kind of activity is forbidden by God in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. So if you're a Christian businessman and a business owner of a small company or a small business or a big company, you are not permitted, you don't have to be forced to participate in, for example, catering a so-called gay wedding if that goes against your convictions. So the law seems to be very, very clear, is very reasonable. Who would want to oppose that? Well, the law hit the books, and all of a sudden a firestorm ensued. Now, why did the firestorm ensue? Because gay activists whipped up emotions and hyper tensions in the community in which they live, to the point where Indiana had to, according to the governor, he had to clarify the language of the law and make sure that everyone understood that this was not discrimination. You could not go out and discriminate against anyone based on your religious convictions. It was simply a measure to try to guarantee that a small business owner would not be forced to do something that violated their conscience. Well, the gay activists and the news media who were promoting the same-sex agenda wanted to make sure that Indiana got the message that they would be punished for passing such a law. There were some companies, even such a company as Walmart, the giant retailer, they threatened to pull their stores out of Indiana. And all of these different businesses began to jump on the gay agenda bandwagon and threaten to leave Indiana, and that caused lawmakers in Indiana to rewrite the law and basically, essentially, write in all of this extra language that would essentially now make it possible for the gay activists to target businesses, to force them to do what is against their Christian or Jewish or other religious conscience to do. So the caterer, the small Christian-owned caterer, if a gay couple came to them and said, "We want you to cater our wedding," and if the Christian business said, "Well, that's against our convictions as Christians. We believe the Bible teaches that homosexuality is a sin. We cannot do that in good conscience." Now in Indiana, it appears that they can go to court and they can be sued and they can have their business shut down and they can be fined huge amounts. And now the mess is even worse than it was. So the law was originally created, and this law is not a unique law to Indiana. It's a law that's passed in many other different states as well. And it guarantees that Christians and other people of religious conviction cannot be forced to participate in activities in which it violates their conscience. Now, Indiana, instead of guaranteeing that right, now it looks like they are going to be pressured, these small Christian businessmen and women are going to be pressured into doing exactly what the law was attempting to guarantee would not happen, and that is that they would be forced under threat of discrimination, under threat of lawsuit, they would be forced to participate in so-called same-sex weddings. If they were a caterer, or if they had a cake, they had to bake a cake for a gay wedding and that violated their conscience, they would be forced to either bake the cake or they would be sued and possibly taken out of business for that. And so what turned out to be a disaster, it started as a freedom of religious right, and now the way the law is written, it probably will lead to discrimination against Christians and others who hold to traditional moral values. So we see how society is playing out before us. And so we have to ask ourselves, where is this all going? Well, it's going probably to the point where all of the churches and all of the religious organizations that were once seen as a very vital and important part of our community, they will be trashed. All of their religious values and convictions that they held dearly will be jettisoned, and they will be forced to do things that they feel are inappropriate and against their conscience. But that doesn't matter today, because what is happening is that this gay rights agenda is put paramount above everything else. And so if you are a religious person, if you are a Christian and you hold convictions against homosexuality, well, so what? You will be forced to do things. You will be forced to bake cakes for gay weddings. You will be forced to cater gay weddings, whether you want to or not. If you refuse, you will be forced into court. You will be sued, and you will be fined heavily until you comply with the prevailing gay agenda that is enacted in law. And that's the way we're headed to today. So we need to really pray, and we need to ask the Lord to step in and intervene and speak wisdom to these lawmakers. We need to ask Him for protection for the business owners who are being forced to do things they don't want to do. And we need to pray that God will restore moral sanity to our country again, because it is going off the rails rapidly. Well, don't go away. We're going to be back for part 2, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this ruling in just a second. Don't go away. Well, welcome to part 2 of Christian Answers for Today. My name is Jeff Short, and I'm talking about the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that was passed in Indiana that caused all kinds of controversy. Now, what was the controversy? Well, that's something that as Christians we scratch our head and say, what is the controversy? The controversy boiled down to that the gay agenda is trying to normalize homosexual activity in our society. In other words, they're trying to say that it is as normal to be in a gay relationship than it is to be in a heterosexual relationship. In other words, they're trying to make it so that everything in society is okay with the fact that 2 men or 2 women are getting married, raising a family, and everything's okay. That is the gay agenda, the normalization of what was once considered universally immoral and indecent and shameful. Now, as Christians, we go back to the Bible. We simply read what the Bible says in the New Testament. Now, we don't even have to go back to the Old Testament, but if we go back to the Old Testament, the language is very strong that homosexuality is a sin. Sodom and Gomorrah, the twin cities, were destroyed because of the sin of homosexuality and other indecent things that they did. So the Old Testament is very clear. Now, when we go to the New Testament, Jesus is very clear. He says a marriage is between a man and a woman. He says a man will leave his mother and father. That is a male and a female marital relationship, family centered on the male and the female. A man will leave his mother and father and be joined to his wife, a female, and the two will become one flesh. A male and a female, when they're joined together in the matrimony, in marriage, they are one flesh. That cannot happen with gay couples. You cannot have a man and a man joined together as one flesh because God has not made it that way. You cannot take a woman and a woman and join them together in one flesh, in one holy matrimony, because that is not God's design. There is nothing in the Bible that ever hinted at anything like this that would be legitimate. So as Christians, we know from the Scriptures, we know that homosexuality is a sin. Okay, now, what is the gay agenda? The gay agenda is to erase that distinction between male and female, to erase the moral value that a marriage is a man and a woman. They want to erase that definition. They want to do a new definition, and the new definition is that a man and a man can be married, a woman and a woman can be married, and the phrase that they use and the cliche that they use and the slogan that they use is that anyone should marry anyone that they love. Whoever you love, you should be able to marry. Well, do they really want to say that whoever a person loves, they should be able to marry? Do we really want to go that general? Do we really want to leave that as the new definition of marriage? Because, for example, what's wrong if you, for example, if you're a bisexual person, presumably that means that you can either go with a male or a female. Well, what if you feel that you love a male and a female and you want to get married to both? Well, you love them, they love you, presumably, so then you would have a three-person marriage. Anything wrong with that? We don't hear people in the gay activist community arguing for three people getting married, but by their own logic, if they say that you should be able to marry anyone you love, if love is the standard for a definition of marriage, well then a bisexual person would then be able to go to court and say, I love this man, I love this woman, so we should be able to get married, three people in a marriage. Well, what would stop it at three? Why not four? Why not five? You know, in Utah, there are families, so-called families, that have polygamous relationships. There is a man and maybe 5 or 6 women, and the women are all married to the man. The man is married to the women. That's polygamy. Do we want to open that up? We want to open that can of worms up in our society in general? Do we want to go backwards? You know, there were communities back 150 and some years ago in the United States, in Utah, amongst the Mormons. The Mormons began to practice polygamy, and they were not admitted into the United States until they agreed to stop polygamy, and until they began to agree that a marriage is a man and a woman, one man, one woman. And so Utah became a state because they were willing to stop polygamy in their communities. Well, do we want to go back now, backwards in history, and allow polygamy? If the slogan is you should be able to marry the one you love, well then that would allow for many people to be married and called a marriage. You could have 5, 6, 7, 8 people in a marriage if they all, quote, love each other, if that's the test. But also, why would we want to stop at just a man and a woman? Why not go even further and say if you happen to love your dog, or love your cat. Now, some people say that's outrageous, that's preposterous. No, there are people, many people in our country or around the world that love their animal, love their pet more than they love their neighbor, more than they love their relatives. There are people that love their pets with a deep, abiding love. In fact, there are people, and we have this on record in the news, that leave their fortunes, their millions of dollars, to their animal pets, to their cat, to their dog, so that that dog or that cat will have a good life for the rest of their life. They leave their fortunes instead of to a person, instead of to a relative, instead of to a friend, or instead of to a cause, a human cause. They leave their entire inheritance to their pet. There are people that love their animals that much. And so then what would stop, if the definition of marriage is you should be able to marry the one you love, why would we want to stop with the species of humans? Why wouldn't we extend that to an animal, a pet, a dog, a cat? And then you would marry your cat so that you would leave your inheritance to your cat, or you would marry your dog. That's not preposterous. Because you see, what happens is when you change the basic definition of marriage as a man and a woman, then you open the door to almost anything goes. Now, the gay activists will say, well, that's preposterous. You're just trying to make fun, and that's a joke. It isn't a joke because the logic of it leads you to that direction. And we already see it now happening with the polygamous movement. We already see it happening to all kinds of other different aberrant forms of marriage. So when you mess with the definition of marriage, you're going to get yourself in trouble. You are going to cause contradictions. You are going to open up a virtual chaos in society. And there's no way you can close it. Because if you start denying people the right to marry, if you set the definition as you should be able to marry the one you love, then you really can't arbitrarily come in and say, well, you can't marry that person. You can't marry, a granddaughter couldn't marry her grandmother. A granddaughter couldn't marry her lesbian mother because that would be too bad, too preposterous. No, why would you limit? Now you're starting to put limits, arbitrary limits on the definition you created to change the standard definition of a man and a woman in marriage. So we see that when we change the definition of marriage, we cause all kinds of problems. But don't go away. We're going to be back for part 3 to talk about a final problem that I see that is happening in society because of these laws. Don't go away. Well, welcome to part 3 of Christian Answers for today. And we're talking about this law that was passed in Indiana, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. A very harmless intent, very harmless motive. The simple motivation of the law was to guarantee that a Christian, for example, who owned a catering service, owned a bakery, would not be forced against their Christian convictions to have to cater a so-called gay wedding or bake a cake for a so-called gay wedding in which they did not feel comfortable in participating in because of their Christianity. And the Freedom Restoration Act was simply say, you cannot be forced to do something like that against your religious convictions. Okay, it's very clear, very harmless, but the gay activists whipped up a frenzy in the media, and the media and the news outlets and the news reporters were all too happy to jump on board this media frenzy and bring pressure against Indiana to do away with this law. Why? Because they didn't want anyone in any sense saying no to the gay agenda. And if you allow a Christian businessman, a little bakery or a catering service, for example, to say no to the gay agenda because of their own Christian convictions, then you have stopped the total and complete normalization of homosexuality in society, and they didn't want that to happen, so they opposed this and say, no, it's discrimination, and they likened it to the civil rights movement. I would say if you are an African American, you should be offended by the gay rights movement linking themselves to the civil rights movement. There is a big, big difference between being discriminated against on the basis of your skin color and being told to go to the back of the bus than there is being told that a Christian bakery doesn't feel comfortable in baking your cake to your so-called gay wedding. Okay, there's a big difference between that. And I think everybody can see the difference. There are many, many wedding bakeries that can bake that cake. There are many catering services that can cater your so-called gay wedding. You don't need to go to a Christian bakery. You don't need to go to a Christian catering service and pick on them and force them to do something in violation of the Bible, in violation of Christian moral teachings, in violation of their conscience. You don't have to go out of your way to pick on them, to force them to comply with the gay agenda. There is no comparing the gay agenda today and the civil rights movement of 30 or 40 years ago. It's just not compatible. And if I were an African American pastor, I would be offended by that comparison, and I would protest against that comparison because it trivializes the true civil rights movement that was done in the 60s. It trivializes what the issues were in that situation, and it makes a mockery of that movement when you try to bring in the gay agenda. The gay community, the income levels in the gay community are above average as far as income goes. They are not suffering. They are not in poverty. Generally speaking, they earn above what the national income average is. They have resources. They have political clout. They don't have to go to a Christian catering service or a Christian bakery and force the Christians to abide by their immorality and make them participate in their activity. And that's what we're getting to in our society today. We are getting to the point where people are going to be forced against their will to do things. For example, there will come a time, if these trends continue, where pastors cannot speak out against homosexuality from the pulpit. Why? Because there will be laws in place, authored and promoted and pushed through by the gay activists and their agenda, and these laws will say it is against the law to even speak out against homosexuality. And if you do, in a public forum like a church or someplace, you can be arrested, you can be fined, you can be imprisoned if you do. And we're getting to that point right now. Now, we aren't at that point right now, but there is a fear factor in the Christian community right now that they don't know what the law will hold. They don't know. Pastors don't know what is legal and what is not legal. They don't know what judges, activist judges, will do when they get certain cases before them. So the big unknown quantity is bringing in fear into the Christian community. And so Christians are reluctant to say anything against the gay agenda. Pastors are very reluctant to say anything publicly against the gay agenda. I have seen that in the Christian community all over the place. In fact, the local Christian community here, I know many pastors have said that they don't know what's going to happen. They don't know what would happen if they did speak against the gay agenda. And that's why we didn't see a whole lot of opposition to so-called same-sex marriage in this state. We didn't see a lot of Christians in churches and pastors and denominational leaders saying very much about it at all. Why didn't they say anything? Because they were afraid. They didn't want to speak out against something because they didn't know what the results would be if they spoke out. And so doing something like what I'm doing right now, actually communicating Christian truth, Christian morality in a public forum, a lot of pastors will not do that. They are too afraid. They're afraid of what the ramifications and results will be if they stand on Christian truth. And so we saw in Indiana, after this law was passed, we saw this big, huge outcry in the activist community. And then the media and the news outlets and the networks and everybody brought their cameras and brought their microphones and caused a big, big controversy until they forced the Indiana legislature to rewrite the law and the governor to re-sign another law, and they wouldn't give up until their will was done. And we're going to see more of that. We're going to see more imposition of this agenda on our country against Christian values. Christians, their convictions and their values don't count for much anymore in society. And so we're going to see that. We may even see in years down the road, I hope we never do, but we might even see churches begin to get their tax-exempt status stripped away, because what was once deemed a very important part of society, the morality, the teachings of the right and wrong, and all kinds of foundational principles, what was once seen as important and what the state wanted to promote, actually promote the teaching of morality and spirituality in society, and that's why this tax-exempt status was allowed. We may see that stripped completely away as we begin to see our government expand into all kinds of areas of our lives. We're going to see that they need more and more and more revenue, and they can raise taxes and they can raise taxes, but they can only go so far there. So where else does this come? Well, we may see the day where people will say, hey, why don't we simply do away with all tax-exempt organizations in religion? And so all these churches will be then forced to do what they have never had to do in the United States, and that is that they have had to be treated as a for-profit business, and they would be taxed just like any other business. Well, that would be a reflection of the times in which we live in, where the moral and spiritual values are being downplayed, undercut, undermined. And so as Christians, we have to be willing and able to stand for Christ and stand for His truth and do whatever it takes to be strong and not back down. We are very much in the way of the gay agenda. We are the last institution that stands in the way of a total immoral revolution in this country. And so we need to be and bear witness for Jesus Christ no matter what the cost. And I encourage you, if you are in a conversation, stand for the Christian truth, don't back down, and don't compromise one bit. Well, God bless you. We'll be back next week on Christian Answers Today.